For 130,000 years, your species existed almost exactly as it does now. Same brain size, same body, same capacity for thought. And for almost all of that time, humans did almost nothing. No art, no symbols, no real innovation. Then, in a window so short it barely registers on a geological timescale, everything changed at once. Cave paintings, jewelry, long-distance trade, burial rituals. And to this day, nobody can fully explain why it happened or what flipped the switch. This isn't a story with one answer. It's a story with three competing answers, and scientists are still fighting about which one is right. So let's go layer by layer, the same way the researchers did, and see where it leaves us. The first layer is the evidence itself, because before you can explain a mystery, you have to know exactly what you're trying to explain. In 1991, archaeologists working in Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa began uncovering something that didn't fit the existing timeline at all. Deep in layers dated to roughly 75,000 years ago, they found pieces of ochre, a soft reddish iron-rich stone, deliberately engraved with a cross-hatched pattern. Not random scratches, a repeated intentional design. Archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood, who led the excavation, recognized immediately what that meant. This wasn't a tool. It wasn't food. It was a symbol, carved by a mind capable of abstract thought, tens of thousands of years before symbols were supposed to exist. And Blombos wasn't finished surprising people. In 2008, the same site produced something even stranger, a complete toolkit for processing ochre into liquid paint, abalone shells used as mixing containers, charcoal and bone ground into pigment. Dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, an actual paint factory, run by people who, according to the old timeline, weren't supposed to be capable of running one. The Blombos finds weren't alone. At sites in Israel called Skul and Kefse, researchers, including Marion van Haren, uncovered small perforated shells, deliberately pierced and likely strung as beads, dated to between 90,000 and 100,000 years old. At Deep Kloof Rock Shelter, also in South Africa, archaeologists found ostrich eggshell fragments engraved with consistent geometric patterns across multiple time periods, suggesting not a one-off accident but a tradition, repeated and taught. So here's the first layer of the mystery, stated plainly. The capacity for symbolic thought, for art, for jewelry, for meaning encoded in objects, existed in Africa at least 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. That's not in serious dispute anymore. The argument starts with what happened next. For decades, the dominant theory had a name, the Great Leap Forward, popularized by biologist and writer Jared Diamond in the 1990s. The idea was elegant, and it was simple. Around 50,000 years ago, something happened inside the human brain. A genetic mutation, a rewiring, some single biological change that almost overnight unlocked full language, full symbolic reasoning, full modern cognition. Before the mutation, anatomically modern humans who still thought like something less than us. After it, us completely, all at once. Paleoanthropologist Richard Klein became one of the theory's most prominent defenders. He pointed to the explosion of sophisticated tools, art, and ornamentation that appears across Europe starting around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, the period known as the Upper Paleolithic, and argued it was too sudden, too dramatic, to be anything other than a biological switch flipping on. Something in the brain changed, he argued, and the archaeological record changed with it, almost instantly, on an evolutionary timescale. It's a satisfying theory. It has a clean cause and a clean effect. And for years, it was the leading explanation taught in textbooks. But here's the part nobody fully reckoned with. The Blombos evidence, the engraved ochre, the paint factory, the shell beads, was all found in Africa, and all of it predates Klein's proposed mutation by tens of thousands of years. If a single genetic switch flipped around 50,000 years ago in Europe, what were the people at Blombos doing 100,000 years ago with a fully working symbolic toolkit? In 2000, archaeologists Sally McBrady and Alison Brooks published a paper that took direct aim at the mutation theory. Its title was blunt: The Revolution That Wasn't. Their argument was simple and devastating. There was no sudden leap. The evidence for symbolic modern human behavior wasn't a European explosion 50,000 years ago. It was a slow, scattered African accumulation stretching back over 200,000 years, with individual behaviors appearing, vanishing, and reappearing across different sites and different millennia, long before anyone in Europe was making cave paintings. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, because McBrady and Brooks weren't just offering a different timeline. They were describing a pattern that's hard to explain at all: symbolic behavior at Blombos around 100,000 years ago. Then, at some sites, centuries or millennia where that same behavior seems to disappear from the archaeological record entirely. Then it reappears somewhere else, sometimes with no clear connection to the earlier examples. Innovation, then apparent loss, then reinvention. If humans had the cognitive hardware fully switched on 100,000 years ago, why would something as valuable as symbolic art and ornamentation ever vanish, only to be rebuilt from scratch later? A genetic mutation doesn't unmutate. Once a brain can do something, it doesn't typically forget how. So if the capability was already there, something else has to explain why it kept flickering on and off across the record instead of building steadily upward the way you'd expect. There's a name for one of the clearest examples of this flickering, and it comes from the same region as Blombos. Archaeologists call it the Howiesen's port industry, a sophisticated tool-making tradition that appears across multiple South African sites starting around 65,000 years ago. The blades are remarkable: thin, finely shaped, sometimes heat-treated to improve how the stone fractures, a level of technical control that wouldn't look out of place tens of thousands of years later. And then, after roughly 6,000 years, it simply stops. The layers above these sites show a reversion to simpler, cruder tool-making, as if the knowledge had been switched off. Researcher Lynn Wadley, who has spent decades studying these sites, has argued that the technique required complex multi-step planning, gathering specific stone, applying controlled heat over precise timing, shaping the blade only after the material had been altered. That's not a skill you stumble into. It's a skill you're taught, carefully, by someone who already knows how. And for some reason, at some point, the teaching stopped. That question leads to the third layer, and it might be the most unsettling one, because it suggests the entire premise of the mystery was wrong from the start. What if this was never about brains changing at all? In 2009, a team led by archaeologist Adam Powell, along with Stephen Shannon and Mark Thomas, published a paper in the journal Science that proposed something radically different. They argued that modern human behavior didn't require a smarter brain. It required something almost embarrassingly mundane by comparison: more people, living closer together, talking to each other more often. Here's the logic, and it comes from a strange, real-world case study. In 1642, Tasmania was cut off from mainland Australia by rising sea levels, isolating a population of roughly 4,000 people. Over the following centuries, instead of advancing, their technology and cultural complexity actually declined. Bone tools, fishing techniques, certain specialized skills, all of it slowly disappeared, generation by generation. Researcher Joseph Henrich studied this collapse and proposed an explanation that had nothing to do with intelligence. The population was simply too small and too isolated to maintain its own knowledge. Every skilled individual who died without fully passing on a difficult technique took a small piece of the culture with them, and in a small enough population, those losses outpace the rate at which new innovations can replace them. Now flip that logic around and apply it to the deep past. Powell, Shannon, and Thomas argued that early human populations in Africa, for most of the Stone Age, were small, scattered, and frequently isolated from one another, just like Tasmania. In those conditions, even a population capable of full symbolic thought would create art, ornamentation, and complex tools, and then lose them. A skilled craftsperson dies. The technique isn't passed on widely enough. The innovation vanishes, the same way it vanished at Blombos, the same way it vanished in Tasmania thousands of years later. But populations don't stay small and scattered forever. As regional human populations slowly grew and interconnected, something changed that had nothing to do with anyone's individual brain. The number of minds in contact with each other crossed a threshold. Innovations that once died with their inventor could now spread to a neighboring band, get copied, get improved, and survive. Culture stopped leaking away as fast as it was being created, and for the first time, it could accumulate instead of resetting. Under this theory, the Great Leap wasn't a leap in cognition at all. It was a leap in connection. The minds were already capable. What changed was the size and density of the network those minds were plugged into. This reframes everything. The flickering pattern that broke the mutation theory, symbolic behavior appearing, vanishing, reappearing across tens of thousands of years, isn't a contradiction under the demographic model. It's exactly what you'd predict: small, disconnected populations inventing brilliant things, and then losing them over and over until population density finally crossed the threshold where culture could stop slipping through the cracks. And there's a chilling layer underneath even that. Some researchers connect this demographic shift to a catastrophe. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano erupted in present-day Indonesia, one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. Geneticist and anthropologist Stanley Ambrose proposed that the resulting volcanic winter may have crashed human populations down to a few thousand individuals worldwide, creating exactly the kind of small, isolated, struggling groups where culture would have been hardest to maintain, and where, paradoxically, the slow climb back toward larger, more connected populations may have set the stage for everything that came after. The theory remains genuinely disputed. The genetic and archaeological evidence for a Toba-driven crash is far from settled. But it's a serious possibility sitting at the bottom of this entire question. Some researchers push back hard on this idea. Archaeologist Chris Clarkson, working at sites in India, found stone tools both above and below the volcanic ash layer from Toba's eruption, showing human populations there surviving the event with no visible disruption to their technology at all. If Toba really crashed human populations down to a few thousand people worldwide, you'd expect to see that disruption everywhere, not just in some regions and not others. The bottleneck theory isn't dead, but it isn't settled either. And that disagreement is itself a small example of exactly the kind of unresolved science this entire video has been describing. So which is it? A sudden mutation in Europe 50,000 years ago? A slow African accumulation that finally hit critical mass? A demographic threshold with nothing to do with brain power at all? A population bottleneck and recovery that quietly reshaped what came after? The honest answer is that nobody fully knows. The mutation theory has lost most of its support as the African evidence has piled up. The demographic theory is currently the most actively researched and, to many archaeologists, the most compelling. But the truth is probably not one clean story. It's probably some tangle of all of it: climate pressure, population bottlenecks, network density, and yes, possibly some smaller cognitive shifts we haven't fully identified yet, all interacting in ways the fossil and artifact record can only hint at. What we do know is this: somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, scattered across a continent, in small groups who had no idea they were being watched by history, your ancestors started doing something no species had ever done before. They started making things that had no survival value at all: patterns scratched into shell and stone, Beads strung for no reason except to be worn. Paint mixed for no reason except to be seen. They did it, lost it, and did it again. They built it, watched it disappear with the people who knew how, and built it back from nothing, generation after generation, until one day the building finally stuck. Every cave painting, every piece of jewelry, every story ever told around a fire, every video you've ever watched explaining where any of it came from, all of it traces back through that same fragile, flickering thread. A thread that almost broke, more than once, in populations too small and too scattered to hold on to what they'd already discovered. You are not the result of a single mutation that turned a lesser mind into a modern one. You are the result of something stranger and more fragile than that. You are what happens when enough minds, scattered just far enough apart to keep losing each other, finally got close enough to stop forgetting. And somewhere in Africa, around 75,000 years ago, in a cave above a coastline, someone picked up a piece of soft red stone and carved a pattern into it that meant something only they could explain. We don't know what it meant. We don't know if anyone else who saw it understood. We just know it survived long enough for you to find it 100,000 years later and wonder the exact same thing they might have wondered the moment they finished carving it. Will this last?